Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here. So just recently, I've decided to go into my DAW and delete 80% of my plugins. But the question is, why? Well, in this video, I will reveal why I've decided to do this and why it's probably relevant to you. Let's dive into it. All right, so in this video, again, I'm gonna tell you why I've decided to delete most of the plugins on my computer. And stick around because I'm also gonna share with you what plugins I've decided to keep and why. So since the start of this YouTube channel, especially recently, I have plugin companies hitting me up all of the time. Every 5 seconds, there's a new guitar sim company or plugin, new drum software companies, and let's not even talk about the analog emulation plugins and all the new companies that are popping up. And don't get me wrong, I think it's a great thing. These tools are amazing, but here's the thing. As time has gone on, my computer has become overstuffed with plugins. And if you've been watching my channel for any length of time, you know I'm a minimalist. I don't like a lot of unnecessary gear, and plugins are no exception. So with that being said, the number one reason why I've decided to delete 80% of these plugins is because I started to hate mixing. So even though I've been recording and producing for almost 20 years now, and I know how these tools work, I'm gonna be honest, having hundreds and hundreds of plugins on my computer would honestly make me anxious and make me not wanna mix at all. Whenever I would go to EQ my kick drum or my vocal or compress my guitars or drums or whatever, I got so tired of seeing a gigantic list of plugins that are great, but that I don't know how to use very well. And that's because I do this for a living. I need to produce results yesterday. I don't have time to mess around endlessly with a new EQ plugin that I'm not comfortable with. So all in all, I was finding that I was dreading mixing, which is strange because mixing is one of my favorite things in the world. Reason number two why I've deleted most of my plugins is that I felt obligated to constantly try new plugins on every mix that I've been doing within the last few years. Now, even though I have experience doing this and I teach on my channel that it's better to use a few tools well than constantly mess around endlessly with new plugins and gear, even myself, I found myself falling victim to this trap. I mean, these companies do a great job of making you feel like you have to use their software. And again, if I'm sitting down mixing, sometimes seeing that 1176 plugin that I haven't used is tempting, or that new drum software. And of course, the endless barrage of amp sims. At a certain point, I was tired of wasting time. My results were actually getting worse, so the plugins had to go. Okay, and reason number three is simple. And that is when I went back to my older mixes, I realized they were better because I was using fewer plugins and I was using the plugins that I had been using for almost 20 years. It is infinitely better to use a handful of tools that you know well than to constantly cycle through and try all these different tools that at the end of the day are all doing the same things. It's not that they're not amazing, it's just you don't need them. If you can't produce pro level mixes with the stock plugins in your DAW, it's your skill that's lacking, it's not your lack of plugins. So with that being said, let's dive into my DAW and check out the tools that I've decided to keep around. So last week, I went through and I deleted 80% of my plugins, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I feel so much better. I've been so much more productive, and I feel like my old self again. And that's what this video is all about. So let's talk a little bit about the tools that I actually use. So as far as EQs, which is a tool that we all have to use as mixers, I'm gonna be honest, 80% of my EQing is done with the stock EQ in Pro Tools. Because the truth is, when it comes to digital EQ, a digital EQ is a digital EQ. Yes, you could use, an analog simulation of, I don't know, a Pultec, and it's going to do certain things that the Pultec hardware does. But we're talking about the last 10% that doesn't even really matter. And yes, I do use some analog style EQs. Like I'm a big fan of the Waves API stuff and a few of their other analog emulations and some of the Slate stuff as well. But again, 80% of my EQing is done with this EQ, and it's been this way for close to 2 decades now. That's the EQ that I use. As far as compression, my main compressor, especially on drums, is this Metric Halo channel strip. Now, I'm not sponsored by Avid. I am not sponsored by Metric Halo. I'm just sharing with you the plugins that I use on a daily basis and that I started to kind of get away from, which was slowing me down recently. Yeah, so my main channel strip is this Metric Halo channel strip. It's been around since 1998. 8, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. It's got a built-in gate, which is okay, has a great compressor, and has just another digital EQ, which is pretty much exactly like the Avid EQ, but it's all within one channel strip. And that's what I use for all my drums and other instruments as well. Okay, for saturation, most of my saturation on my drums and my submix is done with the, the PSP Vintage Warmer plugin. Again, this plugin has been around for, I think, close to 15 years. It might even be older than that. Again, with all of the options that I had at my disposal for free, I was getting caught up in trying endless analog emulation, like different tape plugins, different tube plugins, different console emulators, and my results were actually getting worse. This is true. And also, I was procrastinating mixing because I always felt overwhelmed when I would sit down to mix on my computer. And also, another thing here, kind of a byproduct of this problem would be, I have two main computers, my Mac Mini, which I'm using right now, and when I record at my studio, I bring my old 2012 MacBook Pro. It is so annoying to have duplicate plugins on two computers when you have thousands of plugins. It's much easier to use a handful of plugins, and then you can install them on maybe 2 or 3 computers, and it's much less daunting than when you have, again, hundreds and hundreds of plugins. So for example, let's say I used an analog emulation plugin on a mix I started at my house, and then I was at the studio working with a band. All of a sudden that plugin would not show up because I'd forget to install that plugin on my other computer. And it was a nightmare. So I'm just so happy to be down to about my old school lean setup again. Okay, Reverb. I just use the stock plugin, the Reverb plugin within Pro Tools. People laugh at this, but you'd be shocked at how many pro mixers use the D-Verb, which is the stock Reverb right within Pro Tools. No matter what DAW you use, just use the stock Reverb and you'll be okay. Okay, and this is a big one here. The last two are big ones. Amp sims. Oh my God. It has gotten to the point where I feel like there is a new amp sim company hitting me up every single week. And I don't review their plugins because honestly, they're all pretty much the same. And if you have a free amp sim plugin and you're using a decent IR, you're already almost 100% of the way there. The rest of it comes down to solid playing and editing, right? I'm using the TSC X50, which is ancient at this point, but it still works. Unfortunately, they don't support it anymore, so I've been using the STL Tones, but this is still my favorite one, not because it's the best amp sim, but because I know it inside and out. And of course, for programming drums, all I use is EasyDrummer. I've tried some of the fancier ones. People ask me about Get Good Drums, all these different drum plugins. I stick with EasyDrummer because I know it well. And I actually really like the way that the cymbals sound on EasyDrummer. Now, if I want to change the sound of my EasyDrummer drum tracks, I will replace the shells with my own samples. So I'm either using the stock EasyDrummer sounds or my own samples that I replace the sounds with while still utilizing the cymbals within my EasyDrummer software. Now, the reason why I've decided to put this video together for you is in case you feel overwhelmed by the tools that you're using, or you feel like you might be lacking certain tools and you might be watching, YouTube and someone's saying that this analog emulation plugin is the greatest thing under the sun, you need it to create great mixes. It's not true. It is infinitely more valuable to understand the tools that you're already using, even if you're using stock plugins. Again, I use a bunch of stock plugins and I prefer the results that I get with the stock plugins over the results I get with fancier, newer plugins that I don't really know that well. Another thing to keep in mind is just think about all of the classic great mixers that we know of. These mixers have been using the exact same tools or very similar tools for the past 40 or 50 years. They are not constantly changing out their mixing tools and plugins. They know their tools, they use them over and over and over and over again. They know them inside and out, and that's why they are some of the greatest mixers in the world. If Chris Lord-Alge changed his console with every single mix or tried a different EQ with every single mix, it would slow him down immensely. And unfortunately, these days with how cheap plugins are, so many of us get caught in this trap. And I was caught in it for a while myself. And again, it affected me even though I have real world experience and I'm well aware of this issue. So hopefully you have found this video inspiring and it has motivated you to stick with the tools that you're currently using and to focus on your skills, process, and workflow, because that's where the real results actually come from. Now, I want you to produce better results with the gear that you're currently using, and because of this, I'm offering you direct access for absolutely free right now to my training 4 dead simple ways to massively improve your recordings and mixes. In the training, I show you my #1 technique for preparing heavy guitar tracks that virtually mix themselves. You'll also learn how to create instantaneous clarity within your mix using any old stock EQ plugin, learn how to take control over the levels in your mix so that your instruments stop fighting with one another, and finally, how to craft radio-ready vocals using only stock plugins. Again, this training is absolutely free right now, but a word of warning, if you have the attention span of a squirrel, this training is not for you. It's about an hour long, it's super in-depth and extremely valuable, but only watch it if you are serious. Again, real results do not come from gear. Most people hate hearing this, but it's the truth, and this training proves it in the real world. So I'm curious to know, is your computer overstuffed with plugins? Do you find that you're constantly auditioning different amp sims, MIDI drum software, EQ plugins, compressor plugins, reverb plugins, instead of actual mixing? Let me know by leaving a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear what you've been up to in your home studio. And until next time, drink that Spindrift.